Welcome to a video where we talk about a very hot topic, forms. And more specifically, we dive into what it realistically takes to add internal forms into your own application. My name is John, co-founder here at Joyfill. I'm joined today by Josh and Jeremy, two other co-founders and lead developers. If you don't know what Joyfill is, Joyfill makes it easy for developers to build and embed form experiences into their own application without having to do it all from scratch. So we're going to talk about some really cool stuff around internal forms, kind of what it takes to add that to your application. So without further ado, let's dive in. So today, I want to cover what it realistically takes to add internal forms to an application. And I think there are misconceptions around what really goes into it, especially when you are deeply integrating form capabilities into all the tentacles of an existing software with potentially already tons of users. But first, I want to clarify what we mean by internal forms. Because when you hear forms, it's broad and it comes in many different forms and use cases.
Yeah.
So to clarify what we mean by internal forms, this use case, what I want to specifically cover is that you have a product team that wants to provide forms, documents, PDF features, the ability to fill them out, to build them, take actually that UI and provide it to their existing users, and then integrate their database when a form is filled out by a user, that data goes somewhere. So there's both pieces to the front end and the back end. And so let's go ahead and dive into a little bit of those pieces, kind of give a realistic idea of what it will take if someone's trying to pull this off. What I guess my first question that we should cover is like, what does the back end look like for that forms process for
Mhm.
internal forms?
I think the first question, even before saying what the backend should look like, is what exactly are you trying to build? But some of it also has to do with like the type of data you're going to be collecting. For this scenario, let's just assume that it's like general data, like an inspection form. It's text, numbers. There's nothing crazy, nothing fancy. Then some of the first things, obviously, you need is just like CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. But then one thing we have seen really bite our users is you also need to ensure that you're creating a versioning based backend, or you're creating some type of immutable architecture to where the data that gets collected is not impacted by changes to those original template structures. So that's usually like a versioning based system, or how Joyfill did it. We actually have an immutable based kind of approach to the submissions itself, where it contains the visual layout, kind of that full representation, including the data submitted. So outside of going into the nitty gritty, I'd say one of the biggest gotchas is just make sure you're protecting your users from accidental changes, and those changes cascading in a way that changes data that has already been submitted, or the visual representation of the data that's been submitted. I'd say
Okay.
that's one thing to keep in mind for sure.
Just staying on there just for a little bit because I think you obviously gave a brief description of a few of probably many things to consider when it comes to actually like preparing a back end for that process. With the misconceptions, is it typically very hard to do with an existing system in place? I mean, do they not have these things in place and they have to almost go from scratch and building those things? Or is it more like I just need to take our SDK and then just hook it up, as simple as that?
The reason why I touch on that is that versioning is not a new concept. Like versioning is a very common concept, but for whatever reason with forms, sometimes people don't implement it. I've seen companies as large as, let's take like Jotform. Jotform's an awesome forms product, but even they must have some layer of this not implemented, because if you go to delete a field, they alert you saying, hey, don't delete this field because it'll remove it from all your submissions. Instead, just make it hidden. And that's fine. But what ends up happening is you have a bunch of these like orphaned hidden fields on your form that you're either like dragging to the bottom of the page. It just kind of creates like a weird experience where you're hanging on to all these old fields because you don't want historical records. So it's like a common thing that is, I think, well known, especially around data management, especially when you're dealing with multiple versions of the same type of document or representation of a data. But for whatever reason in forms, people sometimes just don't do it. and you assume that the data is never going to change. Like they build a template and that's the way it'll be forever. What happened to us is we originally didn't build it either back in the day. We didn't see it until a year later, after everybody's forms had existed for a year. And now the new year comes around and they want to start adding new fields or deleting old information that they don't need anymore. And that's when it was the real gotcha, where it was like, oh crap, now it's impacting all of last year's submissions that were created against that template. So again, it's not that it's a new or hard concept to implement. It's really more so just like design it as you're designing your CRUD operations. Like when you're doing updates or deletes against your submission, just make sure you're creating a version based system around that so that they can restore back to it if a user accidentally manipulates something that they weren't supposed to. And again, if you're using the immutable approach on the submission side, that's not a problem. But if you're using the template to submission approach, where the template represents the visual, the layout, then make sure you're implementing versioning. Yeah, so not new per se, not even necessarily hard to build, just something that you need to remember and do. Because once it's a year later and you realize that problem exists, well, and it starts happening, there's no way to go back, right? So it's better just to do it from the beginning, because yeah, you could have that year forward, but you're going to get caught for all that past year of everybody that's making those changes before you run into it. So yeah, it's just something better to implement sooner rather than later, because
Okay.
users will absolutely mess their forms up.
Okay, great. So I think there will be a time where maybe we can dive into a little bit more of the back end, but for time's sake, why don't we go ahead and jump over to what the front end looks like? Maybe Jeremy, you can even address that a little bit. What does that look like for implementing internal forms?
Of course, it'll be heavily based on your data structure. So it's kind of like, okay, so what data do I have coming in? What data do I need persisted? What data is transient? Things like that. But from a forms perspective, what we found is that you always have a template to submission type structure because you want to preserve that source of truth and then make instances of it. And so when you're making instances of it, really the interface just needs to be intuitive from a mobile perspective. I think one of the things we could have done a lot better with what we did the first time versus what we're doing really well with now is mobile. Now, if your product doesn't have a mobile use case, you may think, well, I'll just skip that, but not doing it, building the solution for internal forms, and then needing mobile later is really, really challenging. So what we did for the new SDKs, we built kind of with the mobile first in mind. We have a dedicated view. We're enhancing it all the time. But because of our experience with building mobile apps before in our form products with Android, iOS, we already kind of knew that mobile was going to be a really, really big challenge. And I don't even think we had a lot of the initial customers requesting things even on the web being mobile compatible. Like directly, we just knew, Josh knew from past experience, we knew from building. So you kind of want to build it so that, hey, how do we handle mobile, which is in our case a dedicated view, and then go from there. Because if you can get mobile right, the layout right, and things like that, you can expand larger and larger much easier. Even with really ugly PDFs and ugly internal forms, you'd be surprised how many times in your company or just with customers they're going to want to view that on a mobile device. So how are you going to handle it? Are you always spitting this thing out to a PDF anytime it needs to be interacted with because they need to be able to pinch and zoom and all that? So after you've handled kind of that, and then you go into the rest of the user experience, it's really about how good am I going to make the builder? Because that's going to eat up an incredible amount of your developer time. So you go, okay, I have 4 or 5 months to build this thing. I think I can build it a lot faster, as we all do, as all devs do. I could probably build this pretty quick. But then you realize that just getting it so that they can build a form is extremely, extremely challenging, let alone arguably the more important part, which is the filler mode. So you're going to greatly underestimate the builder mode and people like John, like you, what you actually need to build a form to look away all the edge cases, the bugs, all that. So what a lot of people don't realize is, get the data structure down, start thinking mobile first, and then you look at, okay, well, now I actually have to build a builder and a filler. And that's like building 2 separate whole experiences that have to be managed. So what we've actually seen with a lot of customers starting to use the Joyfile SDK is they don't even have a builder. The developer has to build the structure because they have these exact thoughts. Turns out you can't do that in 5, 6 months. So they don't end up building a builder. They end up just having the developer create XML structures, JSON structures, and they're doing it in the background and then mapping that to a filler, which is kind of the front end, what your internal team is using, what your customers are using. But that becomes a big problem because now some of your highest paid individuals, developers, you need to work on critical features, and developers don't like doing it in the first place, all are now having to maintain and support the entire company's internal forms anytime they need a new one or a change, because nobody else can do that. You have to be a developer to do it. And that's what we typically see. The builder goes out the window, focus on the filler. But now it's an extremely inefficient process. Building forms, updating forms, managing them becomes a very expensive, slow process. And that's where we see people coming over and being like, oh my gosh, you have the builder and you have the filler, and they're both high quality and they take mobile into consideration. All of that takes an incredible amount of effort for any really sized team to build.
It seems like sometimes people don't do the form builder process right. They just do the filling process right. And then that's left to create so much of this time for the developers having to get these requests to go back and put in new forms and hook them up, all of that, when really it could just be a user interface that they can then add to account levels, right, for users if they wanted to build a form for a specific account. And then secondly is create that do-it-yourself form builder for their own users to be able to then create their own. You almost even can remove the entire developer and support staff providing that solution to their users, because the users can just go in there and even really build themselves if they have the proper user interface. We could spend hours on this, but those are all really good points. I think people may or may not be aware of that toll that comes with having a form solution and not having the proper builder. But again, that's what this call is for, is kind of expose that stuff when it comes to what it realistically takes, not only to put it in place, but to also maintain it. So, okay, great. So moving on, I want what it takes to build it yourself from scratch versus what it takes to implement using like an established SDK or a library. So for those watching, they could potentially be in this research phase, or should we build it or should we just buy something and plug it in?
If you go to build it, identify what part's the most important, the builder, the filler, mobile, and really just try to hone in on that and make that a good user experience, and then build supporting processes around that. The dilemma though is forms seem really simple until you start building them, because turns out it's not a couple input fields, drop down fields, things like that. Really, it has to be geared to your use case, things like that. So if I'm building something from scratch, depending on what it is, I need to identify exactly where it's going to be used, who's filling it out, and then how are we going to get them built? Is this going to be a manual process, which usually ends up being the case for people? And if it's manual, what type of resources is that going to take from the team to get these forms built? Am I going to use some sort of library to do it? And if I use that library, am I ready to really commit to that? Because once I kind of integrate that, that'll be something I'm committed to for a long time, some sort of UI library. If you're using a UI library, does that actually translate well to documents like PDFs? Before you commit to a library or anything, we've seen most people just start doing it from scratch. So identify the fields you'll need, identify your end user, identify what is the most important thing, the filler or the builder, and then kind of geared for that. Usually the filler takes precedence because you can hack your way to building the form, but the filling doesn't happen by a developer. It happens by some semi-technical, non-technical end user, end customer, and you want that to be a seamless experience. So also, do your forms have to go to PDF at all? Or is it purely type form, data entry type situation, and you're not viewing them in PDF often? If that's the case, a pre-built library would make a lot more sense. Something like an Ant Design, ShadCN, thing like that, because you're never having to export these things. It'll always be viewed in a controlled environment. So I would identify those three things first and then try to build that out.
Without taking our word for it, forms, as Jeremy already mentioned, are deceptively large and feature loaded, depending on what you're doing, because most developers, when they start, they think it's a more complex sign-up form or it's a complex like user settings form. And that's not what the types of forms we're talking about. That's That's, as Jeremy said, if they're very simple, use just an open source library for it. I mean, there's literally 100 that have everything you need for settings, forms, but when you're building data collection tooling, which is really what the types of forms we target, whether you're filling out PDFs or these more complex forms, go and look at the popular tool used by your industry. So if you're in service, go look at form tools, because there's probably a dedicated SaaS or software application specifically built around your industry, because that's going to have very specific features to your industry and your use case. Like forms is so loaded. Like we have 8 different categories that we put things into when somebody tells us forms. And so I would go very clearly identify what kind of form you're doing. And again, you can do that by just searching other dedicated solutions built specifically around solving data collection for your industry. So if you're sales software, it's likely you're building some type of proposal based form solution, or you're building something that has like embeddable lead forms for conversion. Or if you're in like a lot of the industry we're in, which is like field service, then it's more geared around mobile teams out in the field, very conditional or workflow based data collection scenarios based on, if I select this answer, then I need to say these 3. It's almost like choose your own adventure. Unless you've done that and very thoroughly researched that, you're not going to really fully understand the feature set you have to build. Because the more time I've spent with other people integrating, except for the people that have already tried to build it themselves, and that's why they came to Joyfills, because they realized it was so loaded, or they weren't able to allocate the resources to actually finish the solution, you are highly underestimating the amount of features and nuanced like details that go into these solutions. So the best thing to do is go look at another solution that's already serving real customers. That's a popular solution. That's going to give you your closest reality check to the feature set you're going to have to build. And I guarantee you, if you say, well, we don't need everything they offer, I promise you, maybe not day one for the first customer you're piloting it with, but fast forward 3, 4, 5 years, you will have received every single feature request that other solution has implemented that is dedicated to forms for your industry. I guarantee it. So do not say, well, we don't need all that. They offer all this, so we can build it in 3 months. Yeah, maybe version 1, but I guarantee you're going to invest over a year or 2 of development resources consistently to mirror their process. So definitely just know that is truly the reality when you're getting into building a form solution for your industry. Unless you don't want to take feature requests. Like if you're just going to tell your users this is all we offer and we're not going to develop it, which I don't think any company really does.
Yeah, and the whole reason even for this discussion is exactly that. There is more to it. And there's a lot that's going to go into it. And where was this tool when we were building it? Because building it from scratch is not fun.
Yeah.
It's extremely necessary, because who doesn't have some type of form or document in their software, some type of processing of even a data collection interface. Don't necessarily be afraid, but there is a lot that goes into it. And
No, be afraid. You should be very afraid. Do you guys know Transformers, the slogan? I don't know why this just came to my head. I saw something on it yesterday. The Transformers like theme song. That's what forms really are. You look at them
yeah.
at the surface layer, and it really is so much more than meets your initial eye. There's all these hidden features
Mhm.
that kind of create these very specific experiences, and that's where it gets you.
Okay, so in kind of closing, to give people a valuable takeaway from your experience and building multiple form platforms, what would you suggest getting from 0 to 1? I guess we kind of already answered it just a little bit, but is there any final suggestion that you would give to go? I mean, you had mentioned, hey, go look at your industry leader, go see how they're handling forms, and then see what it takes to build at least that. If not, go the next level and build more into that to get that competitive advantage. If you would start over again, what would you
I'll
do?
do this. This is gonna sound biased to like use Joyfill, but we live in a world where it's moving more away from role custom to find a solution that already exists. So there's this solution, really great solution called Spix. It's for webhooks. Me and Jeremy were like, okay, we got to build webhooks. He starts sending all these features. He's like, hey, do we need this, this, this? Like all these things that we didn't realize were involved in building a webhook solution.
We assumed we could build it ourselves. So I was doing initial research to just figure out what we might be missing. Because the thought, I'm sure every webhook dev has like, how hard can it be? You're kind of just sending out events and you're listening to forum, and you can kind of whip that up pretty quick. And then when there's end customers involved, not just, unless developers are your customers, and even then, probably not the case, there's just a dozen things that have to be there, not even optional, for it to really work properly and as expected. And so that's when we had to explore. And at that point, we were just hoping we find a good one.
I would say the first thing is understand your requirements. And then I would say look to see if there's a viable solution like a Joyfill out there, and if it's going to meet the specific requirements for your use case. Because if you don't have to build it, you're just being insane to build it yourself. As long as price is reasonable, like, some things are just way too expensive for startups or things, depending on what stage you're at as a company. But if it's affordable and it meets your requirements, and in a lot of scenarios, it's far more advanced than what you as a team would have built, then why waste your time building it if that's not your main business objective? Like, invest your engineering, your most expensive, limited resources, spend them on your most valuable piece of your business, instead of these other things that could be solved in a fraction of the time, and they're way more robust, way more supported. But let it start with, again, figure out what you actually need by researching the other industry experts solving forms in your category that are dedicated application. And once you have a model, see what that looks like to bring it into your own application. And just realize you're going to build everything that they offer, unless you just are going to reject customer requests, and see if somebody already solved that problem for you.
There will be a Stripe for every industry, right?
100%.
Why would you ever build it yourself? And I feel, for forms that is potentially lacking as what we've seen. So we're on that mission.
It's also a trend that's happening where you don't want to use your engineering resources, which Jeremy pointed out. Think about like websites. At one point in time, websites were required by engineers, but there was this like outcry by marketing teams to be like, I just need to iterate fast. I don't want to have to wait on an engineer. Well, forms are not like necessarily like your website, but they are very much that way, where most of the people that you want supporting forms and your customers is either you want your customer to be able to do it themselves, or you want your internal non-development team to be able to do it using just a simple interface, versus an engineer literally rolling custom code or custom configurations. So
Right.
it's actually a common trend. So it's not like an outlier weird scenario. It's happening. These no code, low code, or non-technical solutions that do technical things is very common today.
Okay, well, that's about all we have for today. Thank you guys for your time. I'm excited to see more innovation that is to come in the form space. So thank you guys, but until next time, see ya.
All right. See y'all.